Okay, so these are going to be 6 hours. My only consolation is that you will suffer more than me. So have fun. So this is an introduction to design and analysis of key exchange protocols. It's going to be very high level, very non-technical or very semi-technical, particularly the first half. In part because first time I created at least part of the things for a more general audience talk, but also because I think that even when people with good experience with cryptography, if they didn't really went through designing or thinking about key exchange protocols, then this is a primitive that is much trickier than it looks. I mean, everyone knows what key exchange protocol is, but really, I mean, that's what you think until you start working with it, and then you see that there are so many complexities around it. So the point of my introduction is really to give you a general idea, to give you examples of protocols and many counterexamples about how not to design or pitfalls, things that people do wrong. Then in the coming days, you will have talks that will go much deeper also into technical details. So yeah, it's more or less an some level of undergraduate class with some even more high-level kind of things. By the way, I use key exchange as a synonym, essentially, of authenticated key exchange. We will touch on unauthenticated key exchange very briefly. So when I say key exchange, usually I mean authenticated key exchange. You can find in the literature also key agreement. In the past, people use that more. I think that today, most people use key exchange, but it's the same thing. Now, two major sins of mine in this talk. It's mostly based on my own works, and the main reason for that is that I have slides from talks that I give on my papers. So just being lazy. So that's one reason. And the second sin, which is worse, I think it's okay. I mean, in the sense that really, I'm not intending this in any way as a complete survey of works. It's really about principles and basic stuff. And of course, even though I will mention other people's works, of course, but the examples and somehow the development of the things comes from my own experience. So the first part, which is supposed to be about half of the time, is this introduction about what is key exchange, giving examples of things that work and things that don't work, mainly through the examples of authenticated Diffie-Hellman protocols. I will talk about formalizing key exchange, but again, without getting into really the details of things, again, more of what is that we take into account when we formalize the things, when we define, and what these definitions give us. And then I'll go over some particular protocols that include things that are being used in practice now through the IPsec, the Internet Key Exchange Protocol. And while I won't talk about TLS too much, actually I'm not even sure I'm touching on, yeah, I'll touch, but very briefly, but you will hear about that in the coming days. And one of the protocols that I will show, Sigma, is actually, which is the basis for the IPsec key exchange, now basically is also part or some of the basic crypto protocol in the new TLS standard called TLS 1.3. So these are not just curious examples, it's things that are being used in practice. Then the second part will talk about implicit authenticated key exchange, which is what I call the complex search for extreme simplicity. I mean, you want to make the protocol as simple, as minimal as possible, but then you have really amazingly simple protocols, but that complicates proofs and things around it. So to give you some examples of that. And the third part, if I have time, I will talk about key derivation, which is an element in key exchange that usually people don't really talk much about it. And there is some work in the last years that I would talk about if I have time. And of course, you can stop me at any time, ask questions, complain. Everything is acceptable. Okay, so what's key exchange protocol? So, you know, this answer can be given in a very, very wide spectrum, from the very naive thing, two people agreeing on a key, to really very, very intricate models of and definitions. Really a very rigorous theory that can be built around it. Now, things that we can agree is that key exchange is a fundamental. I mean, we like in crypto, especially theoreticians, we like to say everything is fundamental. Everything we do is fundamental. It's just to feel good about it. But I think that key exchange actually deserves to be called a fundamental piece in crypto protocols. It's what bootstraps communications. If two parties want to communicate and secure their data, they need to have some shared key. And I mean, other than if they agreed before they met each other and have an AES key, and now we can use it. But otherwise, you need this protocol that bootstraps these secure communications by negotiating a secret shared key. So as such, it's really the enabler and really heart of secure communications. From the crypto point of view, is also the link between public key cryptography and symmetric key. Usually, in the most common case, we start with parties having public keys and using their public keys and their private keys to establish a shared key, and that shared key, for reasons of efficiency, usually it's a symmetric key, an AES key, HMAC key, or something of that nature. Okay, and also it's the most common form of cryptographic protocol in wide use. I mean, we are starting seeing a little bit more of a little bit more sophisticated crypto in use, but until now, mostly of what you see in practice is secure communications and secure storage, and that's key exchange mainly in TLS as the protocol, TLS SSL, that give the S to HTTPS is something that we use every day. And well, we have now protocols like WhatsApp that also do key exchange to exchange a key, so we can communicate in encrypted form. And again, even though on one hand they are most deployed, on the other hand, they seem seemingly the simplest crypto functionality, interactive crypto functionality, but it already has many of the elements that are common to more involved functionalities. And I don't know if you see at the bottom of the slide, they are deceptively simple. They look much simpler than they really are. And in particular, because we think about key exchange only as a two-party protocol, two parties need to exchange a key, while actually it's a two-party protocol for the good guys, but it's a multi-party protocol for the bad guys. There can be exploited the fact that there is more participants in the protocol. So, very informal, a protocol between two parties to establish the shared key. Usually we call that shared key a session key, with the properties of authenticity, which means that they both know who they are talking to. I mean, to exchange a key with someone that you don't know who that someone is actually something that sometimes has a utility. And the typical case of TLS is that the server authenticates and the client does not authenticate. But in general, we will be thinking about the case of the two parties authenticating to each other. We'll also touch on the one-way authentication case, but the most common case, certainly the one that we will focus more, is the one in which both authenticate. They want to know who the other party is. If they're going to send confidential information, or they want to know who they are sending this to. If they're going to get authenticated information with some instructions to do something, they want to know who this person is. And of course, secrecy, only the two parties know the key that they have shared. Now, an element that is very important and usually is overlooked, I mean, it doesn't come as in the basic intuition, is the thing I call consistency, which means that not only you want to know who you are talking to, you want to make sure that the other party has the same view of who are the interacting parties. So in some, if Alice ends the protocol with the idea, the knowledge that she exchanged a key with Bob, and the key is K, and Bob exchanged the same key K with some identity, then we want that identity is Alice. Okay, so if they exchange the same key, they need to have the same view of who they are talking to. Otherwise, there are problems, and we will see examples of how protocols can lead to break this consistency property and what kind of problems that generates. More generally, I mean, in the previous one, again, I said it's a protocol between two parties, but actually, it's a protocol with multiple parties in each, in which any two may exchange a key, but it's a multi-party setting. There will be sessions that we will define a little bit later, but basically, each session is one execution of the protocol, and there can be one of the things that make any protocol, and in particular key exchange, tricky, is that we are running multiple simultaneous executions of the protocol between the same party with different parties, the same two parties in many sessions at the same time, and any two parties can be running simultaneous executions. We want to talk about adversaries that act. They can monitor the communication going between parties. It controls everything in the network in the sense of timing and even deciding who are the parties that will exchange shares, which sessions will start at some point, they will stop, they will interleave sessions, etc. It's a kind of worst case attacker, and the beautiful thing about these worst case attackers is that these are attackers that we actually find in practice. Okay, so these are not just theoretical notions. These are real realizations of things that exist in practice. There will be a talk. Different talks may touch on this point, but I think the talk by Krawczyk, which is I think Wednesday, Wednesday. You will see many interesting problems, examples of how these bad guys do bad things. Okay, so they monitor, they modify traffic, as a man in the middle. They can corrupt parties whenever they want. They can learn the long-term secrets of these parties. They can learn session-specific information, the state of a session, the keys in that session, etc. We really consider a very general attacker. And the security goal is that even though we have these strong attackers in the middle, we still want to maintain these goals of authenticity, secrecy, and consistency of sessions that are uncorrupted. So if, if the attacker breaks into a session and learns the keys of that session, then we don't expect that these keys will be secure. But anything that is not explicitly corrupted by the attacker should remain secure. And can you see things at the bottom of the screen? Because unfortunately, I think I'll have a lot of stuff like this. But anyway, this is one very, very significant thing that is usually, the models not always make it explicitly, but it's about confining damage from exposure to a minimum. I mean, in crypto, you need to design things knowing that bad things will happen, okay? There is nothing like, I mean, if you're designing a protocol that you expect never to be attacked, probably you are designing a protocol that will never be implemented. By the way, that's one of the best ways of keeping a protocol secure, is never to implement it. But if it's a protocol that is going to run in any real-life setting, then it will be attacked, and bad things will happen. So it's important in general in crypto, when you design stuff, to think about, okay, these are the bad things that can happen. I want to build this so that the damage is contained as much as possible. So if a session is broken and that session key is found, I still want the rest of the operation to remain secure. That's, again, as basic principle, something to keep in mind. Now, how do we formalize this thing? So again, when we started working on this thing, you start from this clear idea of that you know what key exchange is, and then you start formalizing it, and then you start building protocols, and then you start seeing that many things behave, are trickier than they seem. I have this thing which, I mean, I was not sure if to do this part or not, but I decided that I will do it because, it's an interesting experience when you try to define something. I mean, depending, I guess that here there are people with different backgrounds, but when you need to define a new notion, then Oded Goldrach used to say that definitions are always correct, by definition. And that's true, right? I mean, a definition is a definition. You can define whatever you want. The question is, if you have an idea of a concept that you want to define, whether that definition is what is capturing that concept. So we want a definition, in this case of key exchange, but for anything to be intuitive, but careful, because intuition, particularly in cryptography, is problematic. You want to reject bad protocols. You don't want your definition to say that a bad protocol is secure, right? But what is a bad protocol? I mean, now I will tell you that a bad protocol is is a protocol that doesn't satisfy the definition, right? But now we are defining this thing. So what is a bad protocol? So you need to have some idea, some notion, or application scenario in which you will be able to judge what you think is a bad protocol or not. So one way to make sure is to say that, to put terrible requirements and everything will be secure. Especially, I mean, there will be no protocol that is insecure, but also will not be useful protocol that is secure. So on the other hand, you want that good natural protocols will be accepted by the definition, avoiding overkill requirements. And one of the things that you want to judge your definition for is, what do I want to do with this object? Okay, so actually this key exchange protocol is a fundamental piece, but it's a fundamental piece only in the sense that you want to define a key that you're going to use somehow. The key exchange itself, by itself, it's not very useful. It's just the fact that you are going to use it for something later. So you want to show that whatever that security you are providing to the key that you're sharing, actually that security is what will enable a secure application of this key. And finally, usability. You need to work with the definition. If the definition is very complicated, the definition is hard to understand, then it's hard to work with it later when you want to prove or disprove the security of protocols and when you want to compose it with other stuff. So anyway, this is something that is true for key exchange and it's true everywhere. And I think it's worth keeping in mind. And no one in a crypto course will tell you that, so or usually won't tell. Anyway, okay. So let me go here. Yeah, and you know, design and analyzing key protocols is non-trivial. The nice thing about key exchange is that the end result doesn't have to be complicated. Moreover, if you want it to be practical, it cannot be complicated. Huh? No one is going to use a complicated protocol in practice, at least from the crypto core point of view. So to be practical must be simple. Best advice to learn from past experience. We will do something like that here. Now, I mean, I guess that you all have some background in cryptography, but formal analysis indispensable tool in cryptography is something that needs to be remembered. There is no value to crypto that doesn't have a good analysis behind it. There are some things like hash functions and block cipher, basic primitive that we don't have proofs of security, but even then, and there we have all kind of theory underlying things. And in this primitive, the work of people trying to break the things is more important. When we build protocols, we don't need to rely on, okay, let's wait for 20 years to see if these smart people can break or not things. You can actually build a theory. I mean, always, you know, there is no, except for some particular cases of information theoretic cryptography, we don't have absolute proofs, but we do have reductions. And, you know, assuming the AES is a secure block cipher or elliptic curve is a secure Diffie-Hellman group, etc. Under this basis, we can actually prove these protocols to be secure. So this should be done for anything, at least anything that is going to be used in practice. Okay, so that's for this general introduction about the philosophy or whatever behind the quest for definition and formalizing these notions. So my main example will be Diffie-Hellman exchange. This just to show you that I can do animation in a slide. So we all know, I assumed, what Diffie-Hellman exchange is. We have a group, a cyclic group with a generator G, call it G, like, you know, Z star P or an elliptic curve group. And, you know, we have Alice and Bob, which I will call them A and B. So Alice chooses a random X, B chooses a random Y. They exchange G to the X, G to the Y, and then both compute the key as G to the X, Y, which, you know, each one computes according to the exponent that they chose. This protocol, and under the CDH assumption, the computational Diffie-Hellman assumption, we say that deriving the key K, which is G to the XY, by when you only know G to the X and G to the Y, that is hard. So under that assumption, no one can, other than Alice and Bob that chose X and Y, no one else can actually compute the key. Usually just the fact that someone cannot compute the key is not good enough. We want something stronger. We want that the key will be indistinguishable from a random value. And for this, we need a stronger assumption, what we call the DDH assumption, decisional Diffie-Hellman assumption, that says that given two random values, gx, g to the x, g to the y, then the result of Diffie-Hellman on these values with g to the xy is indistinguishable from a triple that has gx, gy, and g to the random, meaning that for all practical purposes, the key that these guys derived is indistinguishable from a random group element. Okay, and we will build on that the key exchange protocols that derive from Diffie-Hellman. Okay, so again, CDH, it means that the key is unpredictable, but I may know half. If all I know is that the key is unpredictable, it means I may know even half of the bits of it and still will be unpredictable because the other half is hard to guess. This is a much stronger property, and it is what we are going to actually assume for these Diffie-Hellman groups. Now, usually, once you derive this g to the xy, that's a random group element, but we actually usually want is not a group element. We want a string, for example, an AES key of 256 bits, or an HMAC key of, I don't know, 256 bits, 512 bits, whatever the security parameter that we are using. So going from the g to the xy as a group element to an actual string, we apply a function called the key derivation function. As I said at the beginning, key derivation functions have not been given too much attention over the years, but in the last years we've done more work on that, and we'll see if I can present about it in the last class. If I have the time, if I am alive, and if any one of you is still alive too. So there are many conditions for that to happen. Okay, perfect forward secrecy. This is a very important property, becoming more and more important every day. So in Diffie-Hellman, by the way, I'm now, this is the part of the short part of the presentation in which I'm talking about just Diffie-Hellman without authentication, okay? So, but the protocol itself as is has this very important property, which is that Alice and Bob are talking, they exchange it to the x, it to the y, they compute it to the xy, they derive a key, use it to talk to each other, and at some point they end that session. Think about it as a TLS session or a WhatsApp session. The session, that conversation it ends, and now the key that we use to secure our data can be actually deleted. So that K that was derived from G to the XY is deleted. Now the point is that we also delete X and we delete Y, right? So now if someone comes after the fact and says, give me, I want to reconstruct the key, give me your X and Y, all right? You can say, I don't have it. I erased it, right? So once the session key is erased, and once you erase X and Y, that's it. Now that key cannot be reconstructed even by Alice and Bob, okay? So this is the case not even at gunpoint, okay? So for, right, if you know about SSL or TLS, these things are changing, but until a couple of years ago, and even still now, but again, now the situation is a little bit better, but people use a TLS or SSL using RSA, and without perfect forward secrecy. Again, there is TLS with forward secrecy, but not everyone is using that. And for many years, no one used that. And what happens is now you exchange a key, and we'll talk about that type of key exchange with an RSA key, with an encryption key. So I encrypt a key under your public key. In this case, the client encrypts under the server's public key. And okay, so that key that I encrypted, only the server can decrypt, and that gives us a key to use to protect our communications. Now the point is that this server that used that RSA key for 2 years, okay, if that key is found, everything in these 2 years will be learned by the attacker, right? That is something that doesn't have forward secrecy. There is a key, there exists a key that the server needs to keep for a long time, and anyone that finds that key learns all the communication with that server for a long time. Forward secrecy prevents that, and thus it's a very, very important property. IPsec or IKE, which is the key exchange of IPsec, used forward secrecy from day one. SSL, unfortunately, didn't. Now, the new version of TLS, called TLS 1.3, only supports the modes that provide forward secrecy. Okay, so this is the original Diffie-Hellman key exchange from 1976. A truly beautiful protocol, but it's only secure against eavesdroppers, and it's open to man in the middle. Simply, Eve, as a woman in the middle, can basically, when Alice sends G to the X, Eve can choose her own X prime, saying, okay, I'm Alice, this is my Diffie-Hellman value to Bob. Bob sends G to the Y. Eve sends her own G to the Y prime. So Bob computes G to the X prime Y. Alice computes G to the X Y prime. And each of them now is talking to Eve. Eve can decrypt everything here and everything here. So clearly this is a man in the middle, and make the protocol completely insecure if you don't have authentication. So the funny thing is that the basic Diffie-Hellman, as I described, is exactly the same as it was written in the Diffie-Hellman paper from 1976. So it's more than 40 years that this protocol is in use. I mean, it's more and more in use, and has not changed at all. However, trying to do an authenticated Diffie-Hellman protocol has taken a long time. I wrote here hundreds of papers, which is a very, very low and maybe underestimate. It's probably many thousands just by looking at the number of citations the papers have. There must be many, many papers. Now, many of these protocols that have been published in these papers are broken. So the track record is not great. And the question is, why is it so hard to get it right? And authentication is, again, a very intuitive notion. I want to know who am I talking to. You can think, just sign a message and then I will know. But it turns out that with the complexities of interleaving and all the games that attackers can play, things are not that simple, and we'll give some examples. And also from the point of view of formal methods and formal definitions, also that has taken more time than you would have expected for this kind of basic primitive. But we are doing better now, I think. And unproven protocols tend to be broken, so you have to be careful about not being tempted to go after some intuitively secure protocol that has not been formally proven. Okay, so this is a guided tour to authenticated Diffie-Hellman protocols. Some conventions. A and B denote the participants and their identities. I mean, actually, yeah, I use A and B, you know, as mathematical symbols, but actually I use them also as the identity. Sometimes I will say Alice and Bob, and sometimes I will say A and B. And sometimes this A and B will be just mathematical variables. In the case of public key cryptography, which is the most common one in bootstrapping key exchange protocols, then we assume that the parties have long-term public keys. So each party has a pair of private and public key. And the public key is certified in the sense that other parties can actually validate that, you know, if I say this is my public key, then there is a certification authority that has generated a certificate signing my name and the public key, so other people can see that. Of course, there are other ways of distributing or sharing public keys. You know, there is a PGP way in which either you meet at a party and you exchange these physically, or you have a set of friends that will vow for the key being yours and stuff like that. There is something like SSH that the first time that you communicate to a server, you will get their public key, and you will assume or pray that there is no attacker in the middle in that case, and then you get the key. So we are not going to be involved with these specific mechanisms. We will assume that either they have certificates or they have somehow some way of exchanging these public keys. And when we write these proofs, these protocols, we will not say things like, and you have to check the certificate, and you have to check signatures, and all this stuff, which is fundamental for a practical or functioning protocol, but I will not be saying this explicitly. Also, Diffie-Hellman groups, you know, are many groups. I usually will use some value G, and the assumption is that either this G, again, was somehow shared or agreed upon by the parties in some out-of-band way, or what happens actually in practice, many times these things are either wired in the protocol, or there is a small set of things that you can negotiate and decide upon it. Again, these are very, very important elements when you actually build, specify, and use the protocol. And in Kartik's talk, you'll see things like degradation attacks, in which you convince a guy to use a less secure stuff by playing games at that level. These are things that I'm not touching upon. And so this is another element of complexity added to whatever I will show. Okay. So Yuda, I have until 10, right now? Okay. So first attempt at authenticated Diffie-Hellman. Okay, so this is the Diffie-Hellman that any reasonable person should build as the first authenticated Diffie-Hellman protocol. Alice, you know, I usually put the name of the identity on the wire. It's like the person says, I am Alice, okay? And that I am Alice usually in practice means he's my certificate. Doesn't have to be like that. Maybe if Bob already has the certificates of people he communicates with, then Alice can say just I am Alice. But in any case, there must be some expectation at least of who are the people you are communicating with. For example, in a web server, in the common case, there is no expectation of the server to know who the client is, and really the client doesn't have to send the identity. But for now, we are talking about protocols that are mutually authenticated. Both parties authenticate to each other. I will touch on the one-way authentication later, but right now there is Alice and Bob, and they want to know who they are talking to, and so you'll see most of the cases where Alice and Bob send their identities or certificates on the wire. So Alice sends this message saying, I am Alice, this is my G to the X, and here I sign it, okay? So Bob now gets, let's assume, the certificate of Alice, can check the signature. So Bob, the only person that could have signed G to this value is Alice, so now he knows that G to the X was chosen by Alice, except if Alice has been corrupted, and of course we will talk about what happens when you talk to the attacker. But for now, we are thinking of Alice. No, the attacker is not doing anything for now. And Bob answers with the same triple, I'm Bob, G to the Y, and my signature on G to the Y. Okay? This is the basic thing, and what most people would think an authenticated Diffie-Hellman key exchange needs to look. Now, there are several issues here. One of them is see why, okay. So what happens, okay, so let me say there is a basic principle, so I should have written this, which is, you know, I said that there is a principle saying that if something bad happens, it should, the consequences should be confined to as little damage as possible, okay? As little harm caused by that thing. So one of the things we want to say is the only way an attacker can impersonate a party is by finding their private key. So if you have a signature key and you have a private signing key, if the attacker finds that private key, the attacker is you. Okay? You know, in practice, we do things like second factor authentication that are trying to even help in the case that your secret key was found. We are not getting into that. We are assuming that if the attacker found your private key, the attacker is you. Okay? It can do whatever, the same thing that you can do. So that's kind of game over in most cases. But we want that if the attacker finds ephemeral information, for example, a session key that you exchange with someone, just a session key, or a value X that you use, which is you use it one time, is an ephemeral value used for that session. You want that if that value is found, you don't want now the attacker to be able to impersonate you in all possible sessions, okay? However, in this case, if the attacker finds a single triple X, G to the X, and the signature, okay? The signature it finds from here. So it sees this public information, but it finds X. Now, if the attacker found X, okay, that's it. Now, the attacker can replay this message with anyone in the world, okay? It cannot produce the signature of G to the X, but it replays it. It knows X, so regardless of what Bob will answer here with Y, it will be able to compute G to the XY. Okay? So we have a case in which just by finding some ephemeral value, you actually allow for a long-term impersonation. I mean, now you impersonate Alice forever. And I think we can agree that that's not a good thing. Now, at the level of practice, then if you are in a setting where your Diffie-Hellman exponents X and your long-term key are protected, are equally protected, they are in the same type of memory, then maybe it doesn't make, this is not such a big deal because you say, okay, if it can find X, for the same price it can find my private key. If the situation is that you are protecting your private key better, in a smart card or in some more protected memory or stuff like that, then this will make sense. When you build a protocol, you want to build it that whenever someone builds these additional defenses, it can enjoy that defense. So this would not be a good protocol in that sense. Okay? Then, are there any questions? Okay. All right, so more wonderful animation. More wonderful animation. Okay, so now I'm showing the next development of this basic protocol. We are trying to solve some of the issues that we had in the previous one. So we'll do it like this. Now, Alice will send G to the X. She will not send the signature. Bob will send the signature of Bob on G to the X and G to the Y. Okay. This one. And Alice will send the signature G to Y to the X. Now, that problem that I mentioned goes away. Why? Hmm? Why because of Y? Why? Exactly. So before, in the previous thing, Alice sent this signature on G to the X, which was completely unrelated to G to the Y, so the attacker was free to replay it. Replaying it without knowing X did not help the attacker, but if he knew X, it helped. Now, signatures include, both signatures include also the ephemeral session-specific Diffie-Hellman value generated by the peer. Okay, so now, even if the attacker finds X, okay, the signature it will need to send here is not only on G to the X, it's also in G to the Y. Therefore, that attack is prevented. Okay. Now, notice that this costs one more message in the protocol. Okay, because now to send the signature by Alice, she had to wait till Bob will send G to the Y. Okay? So there is a price to that. We'll see that we can do actually 2 message protocols that are not replayable, but that we will see in the second part of these presentations. So we solved the previous problem. All right? So each party assigns its own Diffie-Hellman value to prevent man-in-the-middle attack. Yes, so the basic attack against unauthenticated Diffie-Hellman is prevented by signing your own exponent. But now you also sign the other person's Diffie-Hellman for freshness or for against replay. Okay. When the parties finish this protocol, what is that their view of the world is? Alice says, I share the key, G to the XY. You know, I said that usually you apply a key derivation function to get an AES key. We skip that part here. It's not significant here. I share the key, G to the XY, with Bob. So in some sense, the key K represents Bob. Anything coming now authenticated by K is coming from Bob, because Bob, if this key exchange is a good key exchange protocol, then only Bob will know the key. So anything that comes authenticated with key K comes from Bob. Anything confidential I need to send to Bob, I can encrypt with K because Bob is the only person that knows that key. And same things for Bob. He says, I share the key G to the XY with Alice, and the key talks for, represents Alice. Okay? So there is this consistency of not only the two of them knows K because they chose the Diffie-Hellman exponents, also they have a consistent view of who they were talking to. Okay? Looks fine, but it's not fine. I cheated. There's no consistency. You should have jumped immediately and say, no, 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 no. That protocol is not secure. So what's the problem? There is an attack called Identity-Misbinding Attack, also known as Unknown Key Share Attack, or UKS. For whatever reason, that name was given. By the way, I'll tell you now, I tried to push Identity-Misbinding Attack as the name of this attack. I gave up after a few years. Everyone calls it UKS, but it's an Identity-Misbinding Attack. Yeah. That name is a misnaming attack. By the way, and even worse misnaming is forward secrecy, which actually is backward secrecy. So, you know, it's all very simple, so why not confuse you a little bit? Huh? But this is one of my favorite attacks in the world. This was discovered by Diffie, Van Oorschot, and Wiener in a paper 92. So this is how it works. Alice sends, okay, I'm Alice, here is G to the X. Eve intercepts his message and sends the same G to the X, but under her name, okay? What I'm running here is this protocol, okay? What I call the basic authenticated Diffie-Hellman that just happens to be BADH, okay? So it should have been a hint to you that. Anyway, so Alice sends A, G to the X, Eve intercepts, sends same thing, same G to the X with the name Eve. Now, Bob answered according to the protocol, which is I'm Bob, here's G to the Y, and here's my signature of B on G to the X that he got from Eve, and G to the Y that he's sending. Bob thinks that he's communicating with Eve. Actually, he's communicating with Eve. Now, Eve sends this message unchanged directly to Alice. Alice, now her turn to send the last message, which is signature on G to the Y, G to the X, which now Eve does the following. She takes G to Y, G to the X, and signs them herself. Okay? So what happened here? What happens is that we have two protocols, the blue run and the red run. Both of them are perfectly kosher. They follow exactly the BADH protocol. But what happened here? Alice, she started thinking that she sends this to Bob. She got back a signature by Bob, so she's happy. She's talking to Bob. So she thinks that K represents Bob. Bob got a message from Eve saying, I'm Eve. He's willing to talk to Eve. The red protocol is a perfectly fine run of the protocol. Therefore, Bob gets to the correct assumption that he has exchanged the key G to the XY with Eve, with E. So actually, you see, we have Alice thinking that she was talking to Bob, Eve thinking that, Bob thinking that he was talking to Eve, while they had the same key, okay? Both of them had the same key. Is this a problem? Does Eve know the key? Eve does not know the key because the X was chosen by Alice and the Y was chosen by Bob. So Eve doesn't know the key, she cannot eavesdrop the communication, she cannot change the information. However, at least this consistency thing was broken. Okay, so E doesn't know G to the Y, but B considers anything sent by A as coming from E. So let's see an example. Do you want to break down? Yeah, it's a good, yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't know if you will be able to enjoy the break, but with the suspense, but yeah.